The funeral was quiet, except for the occasional sound of sniffles from the mourners seated in the dimly lit church. Candles flickered around the large wooden coffin that rested at the front, draped in white flowers. A soft rain tapped against the stained glass windows, adding to the somber atmosphere. Max, a loyal black Labrador, sat at the foot of the coffin, his head resting on his paws. He had been there since the service started, silent and motionless, his eyes fixed on the wooden box as if he was saying goodbye in his own way. But then, without warning, Max stood up and barked. The sound was sharp and sudden, cutting through the priest's words like a knife. Heads turned toward the dog, some in confusion, others in irritation. Mrs. Carter, the widow, bent down to hush him, whispering softly, "Max, no. Please." But Max didn't listen. His barking grew louder, more urgent, and he began pacing around the coffin, his nails scratching against the stone floor. The priest paused, his voice faltering as he looked at the dog. "Perhaps he's just grieving," he said gently, but his tone carried a hint of unease. Max didn't stop. He barked again, this time clawing at the base of the coffin, his movements frantic and deliberate. A murmur spread through the crowd, people shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between Max and the priest. "What's wrong with him?" someone whispered, the question hanging in the heavy air. The widow tried to pull Max away, but he resisted, his focus entirely on the coffin. It wasn't just barking. It felt like he was trying to tell them something. The tension in the room thickened, the mourners now sitting on edge as they watched the dog. Even the priest, who had officiated countless funerals, couldn't shake the strange chill creeping up his spine. Max let out one last bark, his body tense, his gaze locked on the coffin. The priest hesitated, then stepped closer, his hand trembling as he rested it on the lid. "Perhaps we should take a look," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in as everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The priest hesitated for a moment longer, his hand lingering on the coffin lid. The room felt unnaturally quiet now, with only the sound of Max's low whines breaking the silence. The widow stood frozen, her face pale, and her hands clutching a handkerchief. Some of the mourners exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Finally, the priest gave a small nod to the funeral director, who approached reluctantly, his face etched with unease. Max stepped back but didn't leave. He stood there, his tail stiff and his eyes sharp, as if waiting for the moment he had been trying to force all along. Slowly, the funeral director unlatched the coffin, the creaking sound echoing through the church. The widow gasped softly, clutching the arm of the woman next to her. When the lid was lifted, an audible gasp rippled through the room. Inside the coffin, among the white silk and flowers, lay the deceased man. But something was wrong. His face, pale and still, looked serene, but a faint discoloration around his neck caught the priest's eye. It looked like bruises, faint but unmistakable. Whispers began to spread through the room, confusion quickly turning to alarm. "That wasn't there before," the widow whispered, her voice trembling. The priest leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest as he examined the marks. Max barked again, louder this time, as if urging them to look deeper. The priest turned to the funeral director, his face ashen. "This doesn't look like a natural death," he murmured, the words barely leaving his lips. The crowd stirred uneasily, and someone in the back stood up, demanding answers. Max moved closer to the coffin, sniffing around it with intensity. Suddenly he turned and barked at a man seated near the back of the church. Everyone turned to look. The man, dressed in a dark suit, froze under their gazes, his face growing pale. "Why is the dog barking at him?" someone asked nervously. The priest straightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the coffin and the man. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. "But I think we need to call the authorities." The tension in the room was suffocating. The man Max was barking at shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the pew. His eyes darted around, avoiding the stares fixed on him. Max growled low in his throat, stepping closer, his body language tense and accusing. The man finally stood up, raising his hands as if to defend himself. "What's wrong with this dog?" he said, his voice strained. "It's just barking at random." But his tone betrayed his composure. The priest, visibly unsettled, exchanged a glance with the widow. She nodded reluctantly, and he turned to the funeral director. "Please, call the police," he said firmly. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. The man's expression changed, his face hardening as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. "You don't need to call anyone," he snapped, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. It's just a dog acting up." But his words only made people more suspicious. Max barked louder, inching closer to the man, his teeth bared now. Then, in a shocking turn, the man bolted for the door, shoving past people in his way. His sudden movement caused a collective gasp from the crowd. Max didn't hesitate. With a sharp bark, he lunged after the fleeing man, his speed surprising everyone. The dog leaped forward, grabbing the man's pant leg and bringing him down with a thud. The room erupted into chaos. A few men ran forward to help restrain the man while others tried to calm Max. The police arrived moments later, alerted by the earlier call, and quickly took control of the scene. The man, now subdued and handcuffed, glared at the dog with a mix of fear and hatred. As the officers questioned him, cracks began to show in his defiance. Under pressure, he confessed, he had been a business associate of the deceased and had strangled him during a heated argument over money. He had staged the death to look natural, confident that no one would suspect foul play, until Max exposed the truth. The priest crossed himself, visibly shaken, and muttered, "God works in mysterious ways." The widow, though tearful, knelt down and hugged Max tightly, whispering, "You saved us all." As the police led the man away, the room slowly emptied, leaving only the widow, the priest, and Max. The dog sat quietly by the coffin, his tail wagging gently as if his mission was finally complete. In the quiet aftermath of the chaos, the widow sat alone near the coffin, her hand resting gently on Max's head. The once solemn funeral had taken a turn no one could have anticipated, and she felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. Max, her late husband's loyal companion, had uncovered a truth that might have remained buried forever. The priest approached her slowly, his face kind but weary. "Mrs. Carter," he began softly, "I don't think this was a coincidence. Your husband's bond with Max must have been extraordinary. The dog sensed what none of us could." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stroked Max's fur. "He always said Max was more than a dog," she whispered. "He called him his guardian." She glanced at the coffin, her voice breaking. "I just didn't know Max would still protect him even in death." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the church's stained glass windows, Max suddenly stood up. His ears perked, and he walked slowly to the coffin, placing his front paws on the edge. He sniffed it one last time before letting out a low, mournful howl that echoed through the empty space. The sound sent shivers down Mrs. Carter's spine. The priest placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That dog has a heart bigger than most men," he said. "He's done something remarkable today." As the widow prepared to leave, she noticed Max lingering by the coffin, reluctant to part from his master. Gently, she coaxed him to follow her. "Come, Max," she said softly. "We'll get through this together." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple. Max walked by her side, his head held high, a silent hero who had brought justice to his beloved master. Though the grief in Mrs. Carter's heart was still fresh, she felt a glimmer of hope. Max had proven that love, loyalty, and truth could shine even in the darkest moments. In the days that followed, Max became somewhat of a local hero. News of his actions at the funeral spread quickly, and people came from all over the town to meet the dog who had uncovered a murderer. The story was featured in newspapers and on television, with headlines praising his loyalty and intelligence. Despite the attention, Max remained the same, calm, devoted, and ever watchful over Mrs. Carter. For her, Max was more than just a hero. He was her anchor in a sea of grief. She often found him lying by her late husband's favorite chair, his eyes filled with quiet sadness. It was as if he, too, was mourning the loss of his master. One evening, as she sat by the fireplace with Max at her feet, Mrs. Carter picked up a framed photograph of her husband and the dog. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were accompanied by a small smile. "You were right about him," she said softly, as if speaking to her husband. "He truly is our guardian." Max seemed to sense her emotions. He got up and rested his head on her lap, his warm presence providing comfort that words could not. In that moment, Mrs. Carter realized that while she had lost her husband, she still had a piece of his love and loyalty living on in Max. The following Sunday, Mrs. Carter and Max attended church together. The priest greeted them warmly, bending down to pat Max on the head. "He reminds us all of what it means to be truly faithful," he said. As they walked home, Mrs. Carter felt a renewed sense of purpose. Max trotted beside her, his tail wagging slightly, as if he too felt the weight of the past lifting. Together they faced the uncertain future, bound by a shared love and the unbreakable bond that had carried them through the most harrowing of days. Max, the ever-loyal guardian, had not only saved a life, but also reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs. The seasons passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm for Mrs. Carter and Max. Though her husband's absence was deeply felt, Max became her constant companion, filling the silence with his quiet presence. People in the town often stopped her to ask about him, marveling at the dog who had brought justice to light. One day, as Mrs. Carter was tending her garden, she noticed Max standing by the gate, his ears perked and his tail wagging. A young boy approached, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. He looked shy but determined as he stepped forward. "Is this Max?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with awe. Mrs. Carter nodded with a smile. "Yes, this is Max." The boy knelt down, holding out the flowers. "Thank you for being so brave," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're a real hero." Max sniffed the flowers curiously before giving the boy's hand a gentle lick. Mrs. Carter felt her heart swell with pride. "He's special, isn't he?" she said. The boy nodded. "My dad told me about him. He said Max teaches us to stand up for what's right." After the boy left, Mrs. Carter watched Max lying peacefully in the sun, his eyes half closed. She realized that while her husband's chapter had ended, Max's story would continue to inspire others. He wasn't just her guardian. He had become a symbol of loyalty and courage for the entire community. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mrs. Carter sat on the porch with Max by her side. She reached down to stroke his fur, whispering, "You've done so much, Max. More than anyone could have asked of you." Max looked up at her with his soulful eyes, as if to say, "I'll always be here." And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Mrs. Carter realized that even in the darkest times, love and loyalty could light the way forward. Together they sat in the quiet of the evening, two souls bound by an unshakable bond, ready to face whatever came next.